A whisper moved through the fog, soft as breath, cold as confession. Somewhere beneath the stones of an old French chateau, a secret waited, buried in silence and sealed with fear. A haunting that was never truly spectral, a death no one dared call murder. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was in the waning weeks of November, when the fog hung over Baker Street like a damp veil and the wind rattled against the windows like a beggar at the glass, that Sherlock Holmes descended into one of his darker moods. Cases had grown scarce, newspapers remained dull, and I'd returned from a brief posting at Queen Charlotte's Hospital to find him stretched across the sofa in his dressing gown, pipe in hand, and no spark in his eye. It was a dangerous silence, I knew. Holmes without a puzzle was a violin without strings, brilliant but purposeless. It was shortly after luncheon, as the thick mist began to curl like smoke through the letterbox, that the bell rang with an urgency both sharp and restrained. Mrs. Hudson admitted a tall gentleman of continental aspect, his frame elegant but worn, leaning heavily on a cane and wearing a glove only on his left hand. There was a stiffness in his gait, yet his bearing suggested refinement rather than infirmity. His coat bore the dust of railway travel, and his French-laced English spoke of an education gained west of Paris, but east of Versailles. He gave no name, only a request. I must speak with Mr. Holmes. It concerns a matter that would disgrace a dynasty if mishandled. Once seated, the visitor glanced about the room, as if weighing the silence itself. "Have you ever heard," he said slowly, "of Chateau de Lyon, in the Rhône Valley?" Holmes's eyes flicked toward the fire, then back. "A minor estate once fortified during the Terror, converted, I believe, into a wine-producing chateau." "Precisely," the man nodded. "And now haunted. Lights in the cellars, voices in corridors, guests fleeing in fright. Just last month, a scholar from Cambridge, a Professor Barrow, was found at the foot of the old cellar stairs, dead, his face twisted in horror." "And the gendarmes," Holmes asked, "dismissed it as an accident, but the Comte fears scandal. He sent me instead." "And who precisely are you?" Holmes stood and examined the man, his eyes narrowing with familiar precision. "Your boots, though well made, show wear on the inside edge, suggesting a cavalry injury. Yet your accent, unlike the usual Parisian affectation, carries the cadence of Lyon. The glove conceals not a deformity but a signet ring, judging by the way the cloth bulges at the knuckle. So you are of noble blood, educated, and currently travelling under false pretenses." The man's lips thinned. "You are, sir, as dangerously perceptive as your reputation suggests." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then let us move past shadows and into lamplight. Begin again." This time, the man spoke plainly. "My name is Etienne de Malro. I serve as steward to Comte Darcy of the chateau. There is reason to believe that the ghost is no ghost at all, but a cover for something, someone far more dangerous." Holmes tapped ash into the grate. "A ghost to frighten guests, conceal a crime, or protect something hidden, perhaps. I cannot say, only that the Comte dares not summon the authorities." "Then he has done the next best thing," Holmes murmured. "He summoned me." When the man had departed, Holmes rose with unusual briskness and moved to the shelf beside his chemical table. "Pack your valise, Watson. We depart tonight via Dover." "Tonight? For where?" "For the Rhône," he replied, eyes alight once more. "There is something about a phantom in a wine cellar that offends both my logic and my palate, and I should very much like to meet this ghost." And so, by candlelight and railway timetables, we began the curious affair of the ghost at the Chateau de Lyon. "I see I must surrender the mask," said the gentleman, with a resigned sigh, and a hint of pride he could not fully conceal. "My name is Etienne de Malro. I serve as steward to the Comte d'Arcy of Chateau de Lyon. Holmes inclined his head ever so slightly. A steward, yes, but not born into such a role. Etienne offered no denial. The Comte has entrusted me with the management of the estate in recent years, particularly since the chateau was open to paying guests. I noted how the man's voice wavered not with shame, but with weariness. There was a great burden upon him, though its shape had yet to reveal itself. Holmes steepled his fingers. And this supposed haunting? Etienne gave a grave nod. It is no longer a matter for jest or curiosity, Mr. Holmes. The staff whisper, the guests flee, and something terrible has already occurred. The man's voice took on a measured, almost rehearsed rhythm, as though this confession had been composed during many sleepless nights. It began with oddities easily dismissed, candles blown out in still air, bottles misplaced, whispers in corridors where no one walked, but it grew. Cold blasts issued from locked rooms. Silver vanished and reappeared days later. One maid swore she saw a robed figure drift through the cellars. The housekeeper found muddy footprints where no one had tread. And the Comte? Holmes asked. Etienne allowed himself a faint, sad smile. He is a man of great pride, Mr. Holmes, and greater superstition. He believes it is his father's spirit, displeased perhaps with the commercializing of the ancestral estate. He has forbade me from involving the authorities, but You suspect something more terrestrial, Holmes supplied. I suspect deception, Etienne said, voice tightening. And perhaps danger. I have stayed silent long enough. He paused. The guests have begun to notice, and last month, well, that was when it ceased to be mere rumour. I noted Holmes's sudden stillness as Etienne spoke the next name. Professor Lionel Barrow, a visiting antiquarian from Cambridge. He was staying with us to catalogue some of the estate's revolutionary relics. He insisted on examining the old wine cellars, claimed they might conceal architectural anomalies or forgotten passageways. He descended alone one night. An hour later, we found him at the foot of the stone steps, dead. Cause? Holmes asked crisply. The local gendarmerie called it accidental. A fall. No bruises but the impact. No weapon. But his face. Etienne shuddered. It was not the face of a man who slipped. It was as though he had seen something unnatural. Holmes's brow furrowed. And no sign of anyone else? None. The doors were locked behind him. The keys were still in his coat pocket. A long silence followed. Then Holmes said, almost gently, "The dead speak in many ways, Monsieur de Malro. What you saw on that face may yet tell us more than any witness." Holmes leaned back and regarded the man with the same expression he gave to peculiar footprints in wet ash, one of a restrained amusement hiding razor interest. "You wear a steward's modesty, monsieur, but your cuffs betray you. That is not a servant's fastener, but the crest of the Lyonnais nobility, though polished to dullness, as if you hoped we wouldn't notice. And your accent, though intentionally subdued, bears the cadence of schooling in Paris, not provincial birth." Etienne shifted in his chair but did not protest. "Then there is your watch chain," Holmes added lightly. "Too fine for a man of your claimed station, yet tucked inside the vest as if ashamed." "I never claimed poverty," Etienne murmured. "Only discretion." Holmes offered a thin smile. "Then let us abandon discretion, Monsieur de Malro. The truth, if you please. Not the role you were sent to play, but the one life assigned you." The Frenchman met his gaze. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. Then I shall tell you everything." The admission, when it came, was delivered without theatrics. "I am the Comte's half-brother," Etienne said, "born of a liaison that the family has never acknowledged, though the Comte and I share a father, and the chateau was in part my home. I was raised in shadow, educated privately, and offered a position that would allow me to serve without scandal." "You manage the estate in silence," I said. "Precisely. I am the trusted shadow of a proud man. Holmes made no comment, but his fingers tapped thoughtfully against the edge of the armchair. I bear no grudge, Etienne continued. It is a strange thing, Dr. Watson, but affection can survive even humiliation. The Comte is not cruel, only afraid. He fears disgrace more than death. And so when a guest dies in your cellar, he turns his face to the wall, Etienne replied bitterly, and sends the shadow to clean the blood. Holmes nodded once, eyes glittering with thought. It is not your brother who summoned me, but you. A ghost may hide in cellars, monsieur, but it is always the living who fear discovery. Etienne exhaled as though unburdened. I do not believe in ghosts, Mr. Holmes, but I do believe in fear, and in those who profit from it. Someone has used this superstition to cloak their purpose. Barrow's death was no accident. It was too clean, too silent. Holmes's voice was level. And what would this purpose be? That, Etienne said, spreading his gloved hands. I do not yet know. Perhaps it is a matter of inheritance, or of secrets buried with the dead. The chateau has seen revolutions, sieges, and family betrayals. There are maps we no longer possess, and corridors whose foundations predate even the revolution. A fine stage for a clever murderer, Holmes murmured. Or for madness, Etienne added. Some among the staff have begun to whisper of curses. I have even heard the Comte speak to empty rooms. You bring me not a case, monsieur, Holmes said with sudden sharpness, but a maze of mirrors. I bring you truth, if you can find it. Holmes nodded slowly. Then we must go to France to see what lies behind the glass. Holmes rose and moved to the window, peering into the thickening fog that curled along Baker Street like coiled rope. There is something I find compelling in all this, Watson, he said without turning. The pattern is not symmetrical. There are too many threads for mere coincidence. A scholar dies with fear etched into his features. Lights drift where none should be. A brother in shadow speaks of secrets too old for the law to pursue. I glanced at Etienne, who sat in silence, his glove now tucked into his breast pocket, his bare hand clenched tightly. You believe the ghost is but a disguise? I asked. Holmes turned back, his expression unreadable. No ghost ever wore phosphorescent paint or opened locked doors with brass keys. This haunting is not a legend. It is a lever. Someone is pressing it. And to what end? That, Holmes replied, we shall uncover in Lyon. He extended his hand to Etienne. You have done your part. Now allow me to do mine. Then, with that glint in his eye that I had not seen in weeks, Holmes added, Pack lightly, Watson. We are bound for wine, whispers, and perhaps murder beneath the vine. We arrived in the Rhone Valley, beneath a sky the colour of pewter, and a silence that seemed bred not from peace, but from expectation. The vineyards sprawled like withered fingers across the hillsides, their bare branches clutching at the fog. At the crest of a gentle incline stood the Chateau de Lyon, not grand in scale, but rather in presence. Its walls thick with age, its towers squat and watching. Holmes said little during our carriage ride from the station, save to comment once upon the curvature of the road and how it might conceal a man walking at night. The land here folds in layers, he murmured, fingers steepled beneath his chin. As does the truth, I suspect. We crossed under the stone archway, where a rusted bell clanged once above us. A young man met us and led us to the grand doors, which opened with the heavy reluctance of something unused to company. We were shown at once to the drawing room, where we met Comte Darcy. He was a man of advancing years and diminishing patience, with a long, hawkish face and a voice that carried the brittle elegance of someone who had never once been told no, and would not take it kindly if he were. My brother did not inform me you were coming, he began, pouring himself a finger of wine before offering neither glass nor handshake. I have often found unannounced arrivals to be more informative, Holmes replied easily. It gives people less time to prepare their lies. The Comte stiffened slightly, but said nothing. The room was filled with artifacts of the family's lineage, oil portraits, gilt-framed maps, and shelves of ledgers that looked too pristine to have ever been opened. Above the fireplace hung a sword, unpolished, yet given pride of place. "My family has held this chateau for 6 generations," Darcy said abruptly. "The land remembers its blood, Dr. Watson. I expect you will show it some respect." Holmes, studying a portrait in the corner, replied mildly, "Respect must be earned, monsieur, not presumed by lineage." I felt the temperature in the room fall by several degrees. Our accommodations were arranged with minimal courtesy. A narrow corridor led us to our rooms, which were modest but well appointed, evidently reserved for paying guests rather than professionals. From there, Holmes insisted we tour the estate before nightfall. We met the staff first, Madame Berthaud, the housekeeper, whose thin mouth suggested she had long since swallowed her last kind word. Pierre, the gardener, with arms like twisted rope and a silence born not of shyness, but of deliberate withdrawal. And finally, Miss Lydia Trent, an Englishwoman whose charm lay not in what she said, but how little she seemed to fear saying it. "I've heard every chateau in France has its ghost," she said with a smile, as Holmes examined the edge of a tapestry, "but most of them are content to rattle chains. Yours appears to prefer murder." Holmes glanced at her. "And what led you to that conclusion, Miss Trent?" She shrugged. "You came. One doesn't call for Sherlock Holmes over missing candlesticks." Her manner was playful, her gaze sharp. I noted Holmes watching her for a moment longer than necessary. "That," he said finally, "is perhaps the most accurate thing spoken in this house today. The wine cellar at Chateau de Lyon was a stone vault that breathed cold from its walls and memory from its floor. Holmes requested we be left alone to examine it, and I followed him down the stairwell with no small degree of unease. The atmosphere there was not fearful but heavy, as though the air had waited too long without words." Holmes lit his lantern and crouched near the base of the stairs. "Note the disturbance here," he murmured. "The dust tells more truth than any mouth in this house. A size 10 boot, British made, descending hastily. But see here, at the 6th step, the mark slides." He stumbled. I bent beside him. "The Professor?" "Indubitably. But this..." He gestured toward a row of bottles. "This is what interests me most. The dust is thicker on the labels than on the necks. Someone has removed these recently and repeatedly, then returned them with care." "A thief?" "A searcher," Holmes corrected, "and a very particular one." He stood slowly. "There is something beneath this house worth concealing, Watson, and someone who has already killed to keep it buried." Retracing Barrow's steps from his room to the cellar proved an exercise in what Holmes called deductive cartography. We began at the guest wing, where a modest desk stood cluttered with ink bottles, old estate maps, and several pages of notes written in a hurried but refined hand. Holmes scanned them with interest. "Topography," he said. He was not studying wines, but walls. We moved down the hallway, where Holmes paused suddenly and knelt to examine a groove in the floorboards. "A wheeled cart passed here, recently, and returned the same way." At the servants' corridor junction, he held up his hand. "Do you feel that?" he asked. "Feel what?" "The floor, slightly raised, as though something had been filled in." He tapped twice with his cane. The sound was uneven. "An old trapdoor," I offered. "Possibly, or something more improvised." We reached the cellar door, which bore a simple lock and no visible signs of tampering. Holmes leaned in. He went willingly. There was no struggle until he was inside. He turned to me. "We must ask ourselves, Watson, not what Barrow hoped to find, but whom he hoped to avoid." I could not yet answer, but Holmes clearly already had one in mind. Later that afternoon, Holmes requested that Miss Trent join him in the library. I accompanied them at a discreet distance, though there was little attempt at secrecy. "I trust you've enjoyed your stay, Miss Trent," Holmes began, leafing idly through a book on Burgundian architecture. She smiled coolly. "A charming estate, eccentric, but picturesque. And your work as a translator?" "I dabble," she replied. Holmes closed the book. That would explain why your luggage bears a shipping label addressed to Miss Eliza Marchmont, and your gloves are from a costumer on Drury Lane. She didn't flinch. You've gone through my belongings? No, he said simply. I went through your posture, your elocution, and your sense of timing. The rest followed naturally. She sighed. Very well. I was hired to observe Professor Barrow. Nothing more. I was told he might uncover something that belonged to people who would rather it stayed lost. By whom? That, she said. I cannot say, or won't. Holmes tilted his head. You are no murderer, Miss Marchmont, but you are playing a part. Just be sure you know who's writing the final act. Her smile vanished, and she left the room with a grace born of many exits. That evening, as the chateau settled into uneasy sleep, a cry rang out from below, high, breathless, and unmistakably staged. We hurried to the cellar, and there it was. A glowing figure moved along the far wall, its form hazy, its robes gently phosphorescent in the lantern light. A collective gasp rose from the gathered guests. Holmes merely folded his arms. Observe, Watson, he whispered. Note the movement. Slow, theatrical, with deliberate rhythm. No true ghost ever worried about being seen properly. And the glow? A mixture of white phosphorus and oil, I should think. Applied liberally to muslin. I stared at the floating form. But who? Holmes's hand fell to my arm. Let it play out, he said. This performance is not for us. It's for someone watching in the dark. And as the figure vanished through a concealed door, I saw the flicker of understanding in Holmes's eye grow into certainty. Back in our room, Holmes poured a modest glass of red and held it to the candlelight. The vintage is flawed, he muttered, but the story is improving. I raised an eyebrow. You believe the ghost was staged by Miss Marchmont? Not necessarily. She is one player in a crowded theatre. But tonight's show revealed more than it hid. He swirled the wine. There are two searches unfolding here, Watson. One for gold, the other for silence. I leaned forward. And we're chasing both? He smiled. No, my dear fellow. We're allowing them to chase each other. We need only watch and listen. It was Holmes who suggested the drawing room, specifically the hearth. Old houses rarely change their habits, he said. They hide things not in new places, but in the ones they've always trusted. With no one present save myself, he knelt before the great stone fireplace and began tapping at the brickwork with a silver-handled knife he'd borrowed from the luncheon table. Within minutes, a hollow thud rewarded him. He pried loose a fire-blackened stone and withdrew a bundle of charred parchment, the edges fused with soot and time. A relic, I asked. A memory, he replied. Or a map pretending to be one. He unfolded it carefully upon the writing table. Despite the damage, the central sketch remained legible. A set of cellar rooms with markings not present in the current blueprints. These lines, Holmes said, tracing his finger across faded ink, show passages sealed long ago. Look here, behind the southern wine rack, a blind wall with an adjoining void. And someone wanted this forgotten. Indeed, Professor Barrow had this in his possession, or knew of its existence, and someone, likely the same someone, wanted him silenced before he found what lay beyond that wall. We returned to Barrow's guest chamber, and it was Holmes who discovered the pages hidden beneath the lining of a travel valise. Notes scribbled in haste, yet ordered with the discipline of a trained mind. The script was unmistakably Barrow's. Diagrams of architectural inconsistencies, mentions of the Napoleonic smuggling routes, and a single name circled twice in dark graphite. La Penelope. Holmes murmured the name under his breath. A code name, or perhaps a location. He handed me a final page. Note his last entry. It read, "Tonight I will descend once more. The passage is there. I am sure of it. The footing is treacherous. But I must go alone. I no longer trust those around me." Holmes's face darkened. Do you think he meant Miss Trent? I think he meant more than one, Holmes said flatly. He pocketed the notes and turned to me. This case is no longer about ghosts or theatrics, Watson. It is about history, a buried history, and men who would kill to keep it beneath stone and silence. I swallowed. And we are to unearth it? Holmes's lips curled. No, my dear fellow. We are to let it dig itself up and watch closely who brings the first shovel. It was not until the following morning, under the pretext of inspecting the wine stores, that Holmes and I descended once again into the cellar, this time armed with a crowbar, a lantern, and the half-burned map. The southern rack, as predicted, was fixed to a wall of stone that rang hollow beneath Holmes' knock. In the event of smuggling, he explained, wine cellars were often constructed with false walls. The best place to conceal treasure is beside other treasure. With a short effort and the crack of aged mortar, we dislodged the end panel and revealed a narrow gap just wide enough for a man to slip through. I followed Holmes into the darkness, the smell of damp stone thick in the air. The floor dipped gently, and the walls bore faint markings, triangles and circles etched in soot and wax. Revolutionary smugglers? I asked. Possibly, or a later mimic. We reached a small chamber, half collapsed. Holmes held the lantern high. In the corner was an iron ring, rusted but firm, set into the flagstone. He knelt beside it. This ring was pulled recently, he said. The mark beneath is clean. Someone opened a floor trap and closed it again. And Barrow? May have stood right here thinking he was alone. He was wrong. Holmes straightened slowly. Whatever he found was important enough to kill for, and close enough that others are still looking. But it's not just gold we're walking toward, Watson. It's memory. And memory, unlike gold, is often cursed. Later that day, Holmes sought out Miss Trent once more, this time in the chateau's modest conservatory. I accompanied him, though at a respectful distance, conscious of the electric tension between honesty and exposure that Holmes so often conjured in a conversation. You chose your role well, he began. Too well. Most guests sip wine and sketch landscapes. You sketch floor plans and memorize staff routines. Miss Trent, if that was indeed her name, folded her arms, betraying the first flicker of unease. I was hired to observe, not interfere. By whom? A private interest in Paris. I don't know their names, only that they suspect the chateau sits on something valuable, and that Barrow was close to finding it. Holmes nodded slowly. And you? I was sent to watch him, that's all. I reported what he found, and to whom he spoke, but I never thought that he would die, Holmes finished. No, but someone else did. She looked away, then back. I didn't kill him, Mr. Holmes. No, he said quietly. You merely read a script. Someone else rewrote the ending. She rose then, visibly shaken. What now? Holmes's reply was measured. Now, Miss Marchmont, or whoever you are, we let the others reveal themselves. You were merely the prologue, but the next act is already underway. We returned to our quarters as the bells of the chateau chimed the half-hour. Holmes sat down without removing his coat, his eyes fixed on the frayed edges of Barrow's scorched map, now laid flat across our writing table like a battlefield diagram. It was never a ghost, he said suddenly. That was the curtain, thin, theatrical, easy to believe. But the true production was staged behind it. I nodded. You believe the aim was to frighten Barrow? Frighten, delay, mislead, perhaps all three. But when he grew too certain, too near to something tangible, then it became necessary to stop him. And now? Now the ghost serves new purposes, Holmes replied. It frightens the Comte into silence. It draws our attention to the wrong corner. It elevates fear above fact. But, he added with a faint smile, it also forces the hand of the one who engineered it. You believe there's treasure? Holmes was quiet a moment. I believe Barrow thought so. Whether it was gold, letters, or something older, he believed it enough to risk his life. and someone else believed it enough to take that life. I could not help a shiver. Then we are not chasing ghosts, Holmes. He looked at me, sharp and still. No, Watson, we are bait in a game of grave robbers. Let us pray we are not mistaken for corpses. That evening, Holmes requested a second conversation with Miss Trent. Though his manner, I noted, had shifted. There was no performance now, only gravity. Your work is done, he told her softly, but you've seen more than you understand. She hesitated, then reached into her bodice and withdrew a folded slip of paper. It bore a single name, Jean Morel. Holmes took it without comment. He was here, she said. I saw him 2 nights before Barrow died. I didn't report it because I wasn't sure who employed him, but he was at the edge of the vineyard watching the house like a man exiled from it. Because he was, Holmes replied. You knew? I suspected. Jean Morel, the Comte's nephew, disinherited for debts, sent abroad after a scandal in Lyon. Brilliant, angry, and with no title left but mischief. She nodded. Then he's involved. I would be astonished if he weren't. Holmes tucked the note into his pocket and rose. Thank you, Miss Marchmont. You've done more than your employers intended. She frowned. Will you catch him? I don't chase men, Holmes said. I set fires and wait to see who feels the heat, and with that, we stepped out into the corridor, where the shadows whispered louder than the walls. As we walked the upper gallery, Holmes's voice grew quiet, almost meditative. There are 2 hands at work here, Watson. One that seeks something buried, likely Morel, with his knowledge of the family's forgotten histories, and one that fears exposure, someone who knew Barrow was getting close and struck first. Etienne? Holmes shook his head. No, he lacks the boldness, but he may be an unwilling accomplice. Then who? Holmes stopped at the balustrade, fingers resting on the worn oak. We shall see, but mark my words, the ghost is no longer needed. Its role is played out. Now comes the murderer's mistake, when caution turns to arrogance. I felt an odd tightening in my chest. You think he'll strike again? If he feels cornered, yes. Or if the treasure is threatened, either pressure will do. Holmes turned toward me, his expression cool and clear. We must make him feel both. And so the game shifted, not from ghostly hunt to criminal chase, but from doubt to design. Holmes had drawn the lines of battle, invisible though they seemed, and the first to step over them, he said, would betray himself entirely. That night, Holmes laid out our plan with the precision of a general preparing for siege. The trap must be silent, he said, but unmistakable. We shall not spring it. The guilty man will. He tasked me with a modest role, to remain in the cellar with a lantern darkened by soot. Watching the wall, Holmes believed, would soon reveal a man rather than a memory. Meanwhile, Holmes arranged for a rumour to be whispered through the staff corridors that the professor's journal had been found intact and would be turned over to the Comte in the morning. Nothing encourages recklessness like a ticking clock, he said. By midnight, the house was still. I took my place beside the half-hidden trapdoor, my breath slow, my ears alert. Every creak was a signal, every silence a question. Above me, I imagined Holmes waiting just as I did, in some dark antechamber of thought, playing notes that only the guilty could hear. Would our ghost walk again? Would gold surface? Or blood? I clutched my revolver beneath my coat and waited, uncertain whether I feared the footsteps more, or the silence that meant no one was coming. But Holmes had said it clearly. Ghosts are not summoned, Watson. They're baited. I have seen Holmes perform many roles: vagabond, priest, stable boy, even elderly widow. But never before had I seen him as playwright. And yet, as he paced the flagstones of the great hall that afternoon, instructing Lydia Trent on the rhythms of a seance, it was clear that he had cast each of us in parts of his own silent theatre. You will begin in near darkness, he told her. Use phrases that sound ancient, but mean nothing. Refer to the cellar, to the blood in stone, to the air denied. Then pause, exactly 12 seconds. The ghost will enter. The ghost? She asked, raising one brow. Holmes only smiled. You've seen it before. You know the role. She held his gaze, then gave a small nod. And the audience. All present, Holmes replied. The Comte, Etienne, the staff, and those who must hear what is not meant for them. Won't they suspect? Oh, they will suspect everything except the truth. I stood aside, deeply uneasy. Holmes, this is dangerous. All theatre is, he said lightly. But the truth, Watson, is most dangerous of all when it takes the shape of a lie. And so, that evening, the chateau prepared for a ghost. Not summoned from beyond, but constructed by mind and motive. To my astonishment, the Comte d'Arcy agreed to attend the seance. Whether it was out of curiosity, desperation, or something deeper, I could not say. But as the group descended into the lower chamber, lanterns flickering along the walls, I saw something in his step that startled me. Hesitation. Holmes had arranged the room to resemble the Gothic salons of legend. Dusty wine barrels formed a crude circle, and in their centre stood Miss Trent in dark velvet, her face drawn and pale, as though truly touched by visions. The Comte took his place stiffly, flanked by Etienne, who looked as though he'd swallowed iron. Holmes leaned to me. Watch his hands, Watson, not his eyes. The ceremony began. Miss Trent intoned a series of half-rhymes in a voice neither natural nor theatrical, but oddly in between. She spoke of the cellar, of hidden mouths, of vengeance bound by stone. The Comte shifted. Etienne looked away. When the name Barrow fell from her lips, the Comte's wineglass cracked in his hand. Holmes's voice was low and pleased. The ghost hasn't spoken yet, and already we have a commotion of nerves. The room dimmed. Miss Trent raised her arms, and then the ghost arrived. It entered without warning, drifting in from the far wall, its form faintly luminescent, the folds of its robe flickering with pale fire, as though lit by some subterranean flame. A gasp rippled through the room. Lydia Trent fell silent mid-sentence and turned, as if surprised. Only Holmes did not move. The gait, he murmured to me. Measured, theatrical. This ghost has rehearsed its haunting. I could not speak. The figure glided past the barrels, arms outstretched. A low groan, whether from lips or some infernal trick, escaped its hood. Madame Berthaud clutched her crucifix. The Comte whispered his father's name. Holmes stepped forward, calm as a man watching an amateur performance. Not a ghost, he said to no one in particular. Not a spirit. A man with purpose. The ghost turned to him. Holmes extended one hand. Reveal yourself, he said. But the ghost did not stop. It turned instead toward the eastern wall, the wall Holmes had long suspected of concealing the passage. And in a motion that was at once fluid and practiced, it slipped through a crack in the stone, vanishing. Holmes turned to me. Now, Watson. I was already moving. Up the stair, round the corridor, through the concealed arch he had shown me the day before. The passage curved like a serpent. At the far end, footsteps echoed. Holmes's voice had been calm. Mine was hammering in my chest. I reached the trapdoor and waited. For a ghost cannot be caught by hands, but a man can. I pressed myself into the alcove, heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, faster, heels striking stone, breath growing ragged. And then I saw him. The glowing figure slipped through the tunnel mouth like a swimmer rising for air. I waited until he passed, then lunged. We fell hard. His hood flew back. The phosphorescent robe tore like tissue. Jean Morel, I said aloud, as if naming him gave me power. He struggled violently, but I had the advantage of position. A firm blow from my revolver butt ended his resistance. When Holmes arrived moments later, he found me seated atop a man whose skin gleamed like a lantern and whose expression was one of stunned fury. Holmes crouched beside him. "Bonsoir, Monsieur Morel. You've travelled a long way to haunt your own inheritance." Morel spat at his feet. "You know nothing." "Oh, on the contrary," Holmes replied. "I know you forged the ghost with clever lighting, that you entered through a tunnel you helped repair 5 years ago, and that you came not for vengeance, but for gold. You know nothing of my family." "No," Holmes said softly, "but I know what men become when denied their legacy. I know what ghosts they conjure." Morel looked away. "I frightened him," he said. "That was all. Just frightened him." "Frightened whom?" "The professor." "And when fright failed?" He said nothing. Holmes stood. "Then we must let someone else answer." And in his voice was a finality that chilled me more than the cellar ever had. Morel was taken to a side chamber, guarded by 2 of the Comte's servants, though I had little doubt Holmes had arranged their presence well in advance. Meanwhile, the others had returned upstairs, visibly shaken. The Comte had said little. Etienne had said nothing at all. Holmes stood before the group and addressed them in his most dispassionate tone. "Jean Morel admits to orchestrating the hauntings. He used phosphorescent chemicals, a secret tunnel, and the credulity of guests to mask his true purpose, locating a hidden passage beneath the cellar, believed to contain contraband from the Revolutionary era." The Comte leaned forward. "And did he find it?" "No," Holmes said simply. "Because he was not the first to try." He turned to Etienne. "You followed Barrow that night. You saw the map. You opened the trapdoor after him, and you closed it when he fell." Etienne rose, trembling. "You have no proof." Holmes's voice was like glass. "I have the scrap of Barrow's coat wedged beneath the flagstone. I have the scent of the same imported oil you wear upon your gloves, found near the professor's lamp. And I have your silence, monsieur, which speaks louder than your brother's shame." Etienne said nothing. Holmes finished his wine and set the glass down gently. "You killed not for treasure, but for fear. Fear of what Barrow would find. Fear of what the past might reveal about the family that sheltered you in silence. And with that, the ghost of the chateau was exorcised, not by prayer or seance, but by truth laid bare under Holmes's calm and merciless light." Holmes lingered near the lantern, its faint glow dancing across the rough-hewn walls of the cellar. Etienne stood stiffly, arms crossed, his gaze fixed upon Jean Morel, who now sat slumped and silent, more man than menace. "Curious," Holmes said mildly, "how often the shadow cast by guilt falls not on the criminal, but on the one who watches him." Etienne shifted. "You've made your accusations. Shall I applaud?" "You should," Holmes replied, "for your part was masterfully played. The devoted cousin, the grieving scholar, the passive observer." He took a step closer. "But you overreached, Etienne. You always do." "I have done nothing." Holmes glanced at me. "Watson, do you recall the ink blot on Barrow's discarded notes?" I nodded. "And the missing line, cut with a blade so precisely that only someone familiar with his shorthand could replicate it?" "You said it was too perfect," I recalled. "Indeed. And who but Etienne had access to both Barrow's study and the patience to forge a replacement chart, leading Morel in circles?" Etienne paled. Holmes's voice remained calm, almost amused. "You knew of the treasure, Etienne, but unlike Morel, you knew exactly where it lay, and how dangerous it was that Barrow suspected the same. So, you gave him a map, a false one that would lead him into the trap you had already primed. You're mad." "And yet," Holmes said, "the stones do not lie. The cellar's edge bears Barrow's boot mark, fresh the night he vanished, and next to it, a smear of wax from your walking stick." Etienne's expression twisted, but Holmes was not finished. "One ghost frightened, The other killed. Holmes turned from Etienne to the rest of us, his tone no longer sharp, but cool and narrative, like a physician dissecting an old wound. There is a reason the cellar was sealed after the Revolution, not merely for treasure, but for memory, for silence. The Comte's grandfather was not only a hoarder of wealth, but a guardian of shame. The Comte stiffened. You presume too much. On the contrary, said Holmes. I infer only what the records admit. The late Marquis harboured émigrés and contraband in those tunnels. Yes, but he also permitted certain arrangements with foreign agents. Payments, documents, names passed through that floor like smoke. Barrow found reference to them in the archives. And you, Etienne, realised what his discovery would mean. Etienne looked away. Holmes continued. If exposed, your family's honour would have been torn from its pages. No more patronage, no more scholarships, no more quiet influence. You silenced Barrow not out of greed, but preservation. You chose the death of one to protect the reputation of many. I never meant to kill him, Etienne muttered. He slipped, I swear it. I only followed to frighten him. He stepped back. The floor held, Holmes interrupted. But you pushed, or shouted, or did nothing as he fell. That is enough. There was a silence, thick as dust. Then the Comte spoke, voice brittle. And you, Monsieur Holmes, what now? Holmes turned, his gaze as pale as ever. Now, I suggest you decide whether your family's sins are best buried further, or confessed at last. But make no mistake, Monsieur Darcy. The cellar will not hold its dead forever. Etienne made a break for it. Not up the stairs, but deeper into the warren of the cellar, perhaps hoping for some tunnel unknown, even to Holmes. It was a mistake. Two shadows detached from the far wall. Men Holmes had stationed hours earlier under the guise of servants. There was a scuffle, a brief cry, and then silence. Holmes merely sighed. Predictable. I looked at him. Did you truly know he would run? My dear Watson, he said, brushing the dust from his sleeve. When guilt has nowhere to hide, it prefers motion. By morning, the cellar had been sealed once more, this time not with rumour and rotting boards, but with iron locks and a signed confession. Morel would face trial in Bordeaux. Etienne would face a longer punishment still. Disgrace, the slow erosion of respectability, and the bitter taste of a name once spoken with pride. As we left the chateau, I glanced back at the weathered stones and felt the strangest sense, not of victory, but of weariness. Holmes caught my look. Ghosts, Watson, he murmured, are not born from death. They are born from secrets. And with that, the door behind us closed. The assembled household sat in silence, the grand salon flickering with the uncertain light of the hearth. Holmes stood before the fire, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, the other holding a slender cigar he had yet to light. If I may, he began softly, I should like to offer a narrative, not of spirits, but of men. No one interrupted. He continued, Mr. Barrow was not a fool, though some in this room dismissed him as such. He followed the trail of family legend with the eyes of a scholar and the instincts of a hound. What he found, I believe, was not merely gold, but guilt. And guilt, like certain fungi, thrives in the dark. The Comte made a sound, half protest, half sigh. Holmes turned slightly. Barrow's disappearance was no accident, nor was it the work of some phantom hand. Each step, from the missing documents to the vanishing velvet glove, was part of a careful orchestration, some of it theatrical, some of it desperate. And at the centre of it all stood two figures, one in the shadows and one pretending to be frightened of them. Etienne looked away. Holmes finally lit his cigar. Let us speak plainly. There are no ghosts beneath this roof, only secrets, and men who will do anything to keep them buried. He gestured to the chair beside him. Dr. Watson, if you please, you took the liberty of sketching Barrow's boot tread. Would you show them where it leads? I rose, feeling all too aware of the dozen eyes upon me. From my coat pocket, I retrieved the penciled tracing I'd made at Holmes's instruction. He nodded, and I handed it to the Comte. You see, Holmes said, Barrow's last known steps led not toward the chateau, but beneath it, into the cellars, into legend. He exhaled slowly. Now, as to the hauntings, those are more delicate and more absurd. A faint laugh escaped Lydia Trent, quickly stifled. Holmes continued. The phosphorescent figure seen in the lower halls, an oil-based solution applied to silk, a technique described in a French scientific journal 10 years ago. The voices in the corridor, reeds, blown by tubes embedded in the wall behind the armory. Ingenious, yes, but juvenile. Jean Morel, seated beside a gendarme, said nothing. But why? The Comte demanded. Why would my own cousin stoop to such idiocy? Holmes turned his sharp gaze on Morel. Because a haunting is a perfect distraction. While the household fretted over ghosts, Monsieur Morel tunnelled into history, seeking not justice, but inheritance. Morel's jaw twitched. Sadly, Holmes said, he was not alone in his search, and it was not Morel who killed Barrow. Silence once again fell. Holmes tapped his cigar into the hearth. There are those, he said, who wear fear like a cloak, and those who craft it stitch by stitch. He glanced toward Etienne, who stared fixedly into the flames. Holmes's voice dropped as he approached the heart of the matter. It is my belief that Etienne followed Barrow the night he vanished, not to guide him, but to confront him. Etienne flinched, but said nothing. Barrow had begun to suspect that the legends were more than legend. He had spoken with villagers, cross-referenced old army manifests, and, most damning, discovered that the map he had been given was a clever forgery. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A forgery that I suspect Etienne created. The younger man's knuckles whitened against the chair. Now picture it, Holmes went on, his tone crisp. Two men in a damp corridor, one excited, perhaps a little reckless, the other afraid, not for himself, but for the ruin of something far greater. Reputation, legacy, family name. He paused. Barrow turns. Shows Etienne the original parchment he has rediscovered. He means to publish, to speak. And Etienne, in a moment of desperation, acts. A shove? I asked quietly. Perhaps. Or perhaps merely a word. Something that startles, that causes Barrow to misstep. But Etienne did not help him. He did not call for aid. He let him fall. The Comte rose abruptly, but Holmes raised a hand. There is no honour in silence, sir, nor safety. Etienne's shoulders sagged. I thought he would crawl out. I returned later, but... His voice cracked. It was too late. Holmes said nothing more. He simply turned away, his expression unreadable. In that stillness I heard Lydia Trent whisper, and so the dead speak. It was some time before anyone moved. Then Holmes, in a tone lighter than the moment warranted, said, The past, it seems, has teeth sharper than we imagine. He looked to the Comte. You asked why Etienne would go so far. Let me answer with a question. What might you do to protect your father's name? The old man frowned. My father served the Republic. Yes, and betrayed it, Holmes said plainly. He dealt with royalists. He accepted bribes. He used the chateau's cellars to move gold from Austria to French émigrés in England, all carefully kept from public view, until Mr. Barrow stumbled across it. I never knew, the Comte murmured. I believe you, Holmes said. But Etienne did. He found letters, perhaps even records, enough to piece together a version of history quite different from the one you were told. And when Barrow began to dig, Etienne feared the collapse of all he held sacred. Holmes stepped back from the fire. His motive was not greed, it was preservation. He acted not for himself, but for what he believed was right. That, he added, does not absolve him. Etienne bowed his head. I tried to frighten Barrow off with stories, with lights. When that failed, I acted. I cannot undo it. No, Holmes replied, but you can confess it. As the clock chimed above the mantel, no one spoke. In that hush, broken only by the fire's sigh, the truth lay, still and cold, and finally revealed. It was his handwriting that first betrayed him, Holmes said, folding his arms, with a flicker of satisfaction in his eye. I blinked. Etienne's? Precisely. You may recall the annotated copy of the chateau's architectural registry we found on Barrow's desk. The notes were written in an elegant, slanted hand, affectedly Florentine in its loops, yet punctuated with curiously abrupt breaks. Holmes gestured to a folded page he had retrieved earlier. Such a script does not emerge from common schools. It is the product of private tutors and a classical education, one found typically in the salons of the nobility. The Comte stared. Are you saying? I am saying, Holmes interrupted smoothly, that Etienne was never the steward's son. He is your brother's son, an heir, however inconvenient. A long pause followed. Etienne did not protest. Holmes continued, You see, Watson, he wore it not in his coat, nor in his manner, but in his pen. He wrote not like a servant, but like a marquis. One cannot forge breeding forever. But why hide it? I asked. For the same reason ancient families bury illegitimate branches, Holmes replied. To preserve the illusion of unbroken honour. Etienne, in his own way, sought to reclaim what he believed was stolen from him. His actions, however tragic, were born of silence and lineage. The Comte turned pale and sat down heavily. I could not help but glance again at the page in my hand. So much power in a single stroke of ink. Holmes now turned his attention to Miss Lydia Trent, who stood by the window, her composure brittle. As for you, madam, he said lightly, you are neither a criminal nor a ghost. You are an actress. She gave a soft, ironic smile. I never denied it. No, Holmes said, but you never clarified it either. I interjected. But she was in Barrow's confidence, Holmes. Might she not have been an accomplice? Holmes raised an eyebrow. Hardly. Miss Trent is a connoisseuse of obscurity. She follows mysteries the way others follow fashion, chasing shadows and collecting secrets, never intending to act upon them. Lydia tilted her head. I was drawn to the legend, not the man. Barrow promised discovery, not romance. He spoke too much, trusted too easily. I did neither. Holmes offered a faint nod. Indeed. You observed, perhaps manipulated a little, but never touched the crime. A shadow chaser, as I said. In a different age, you'd have made a capable intelligence agent, or an admirable charlatan. Her smile widened. You flatter me. Not intentionally. There was a flicker of amusement in his voice. But why the note? I asked. Why vanish? She shrugged. I saw which way the wind was blowing, and I had no desire to be caught in a storm not of my making. Holmes nodded again. The wise know when to exit the stage. Thus, Lydia Trent faded as she had arrived, in mystery, but not in guilt. Holmes took his place once more before the hearth, his features composed but alert. He stared into the coals, as though consulting them for philosophy rather than warmth. 2 ghosts haunted this house, he said at length. But neither was dead. I leaned forward. Etienne and Morel. Precisely. Morel, the engineer of illusions, harmless, even laughable. His ghost was made of tricks, glows, sounds, and misdirection. A child's haunting, meant to frighten adults into leaving him to his digging. He exhaled. And then there was Etienne, the strategist. No tricks, only silence. His ghost was internal, a burden he carried, one shaped by family dishonour and quiet shame. Morel frightened others. Etienne frightened himself. I was struck by the contrast. One ghost was a fool, Holmes went on, the other a soldier in retreat. Yet both chose shadows over light. Both believed deception more powerful than truth, I ventured, and both paid for it. Morel, Holmes said dryly, will pay with reputation, Etienne, more dearly. There was no triumph in his voice, only a chill sort of regret. And the gold? I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. Ah, yes, revolutionary gold, hidden so cleverly that even its seekers tripped over one another in pursuit. It remains where it was left, untouched by either fool or strategist. He looked at me, and for a moment, his expression softened. It is not gold that ruins men, Watson. It is the ghosts they raise in the search for it. Later, as we waited for the carriage to convey us to the station, Holmes drew his coat tight against the chill and produced his pipe. He lit it slowly. You know, Watson, he murmured, the dead have remarkable patience. They wait years, sometimes decades, for their secrets to be uncovered. And when they speak, it is never without consequence. I glanced back toward the chateau, now still as a tomb. Do you mean Barrow? I asked. Barrow, yes, but also the elder de Rochefort, and the men he betrayed, and the gold he buried with the lie. Their deeds linger, like fingerprints in dust. He puffed. It is not merely crime that stirs the past. Pride is a more persistent ghost. Pride and the desire to control a story long since written. Do you think Etienne will confess fully? I asked. Holmes was quiet for a moment. In time, the weight of silence is rarely sustainable. He looked up at the sky, the clouds beginning to dissolve in pale sunlight. And Miss Trent? I asked. She will write a book, Holmes said dryly. It will sell well. Most of it will be nonsense, but the public will enjoy the suggestion that the dead walked at Rochefort. I laughed in spite of myself. Watson, Holmes said, turning, have you ever considered how much mischief could be avoided if people read more history and less fiction? I smiled. And yet here we are, part of another tale. Holmes chuckled. Indeed, my dear fellow, indeed. Morning had come in a hush. The chateau lay cloaked in a pale mist that curled over its stone balustrades and hung low among the vines, as though reluctant to surrender the secrets of the night. Holmes and I stood at the top of the grand stair, valises in hand, and gazed across the garden where frost still clung to the edges of the fountain. All was quiet now. The cellars had been sealed, the family withdrawn into their private rooms, and the last echoes of Barrow's wild theories had faded into respectful silence. I suppose, I murmured, that this house will not speak of ghosts for some time. Holmes regarded the fog with a faint smile. No, Watson, but silence, too, is a kind of haunting. It struck me then how little had changed outwardly, and yet how thoroughly the house had been exorcised, less of phantoms than of the truths it had tried so long to forget. When we descended to the foyer, Miss Trent was gone. Her room stood open, her belongings neatly folded into absence. No servant had seen her leave, yet none were surprised at her disappearance. On the table, half concealed beneath a paperweight of brass ivy leaves, lay a single item, a pale glove, soft as a whisper, and beside it a note folded twice and addressed to Holmes in a delicate, looping script. He opened it without comment. I watched him read in silence, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly at one line, then softening by a degree at the close. He returned the note to its place. Well, I asked. Nothing criminal, he replied, but everything theatrical. He took the glove and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. She played her role to the end, he added, and exited with the timing of a true professional. I could not tell if he admired or merely recognized the act, perhaps both. As we waited for the cart to take us to the station, Holmes lit a cigarette and leaned against the frost-slicked rail. "You know, Watson," he said, "it is curious how often men conjure ghosts when what they seek is gold." I said nothing, content to let his thoughts unspool. The phantom that walks at night, the moans from the crypt, the whisper in the hall, they serve a purpose, not to terrify, but to distract. A spectre is so much more useful than suspicion. He exhaled. Barrow sought glory. Morel sought gold. Etienne sought silence. All three chose shadows. And Miss Trent? Holmes gave a slight shrug. Ah, Miss Trent. She sought mystery for its own sake. There is something decadent in that pursuit. Harmless, usually, until the stage becomes too real. I could not help but shiver, though the wind had grown no colder. Belief, Holmes murmured, is the most dangerous disguise of all. The train arrived with a low moan that seemed to rise from beneath the earth itself. We boarded in silence. As the landscape slid by, still silvered with dawn, Holmes grew contemplative. At length, he turned to me. "There's a peculiar symmetry to it all, wouldn't you say?" "In what sense?" I asked. He gestured vaguely. "A house built on ancient pride, a servant with noble blood, a treasure hidden, and a reputation buried with it, and all of it dressed in theatrical fog." I nodded slowly. "Do you think the family will recover?" "They always do," Holmes said. "Aristocracy has a splendid instinct for denial." We both laughed softly and then fell again into stillness. Outside, the vineyards gave way to woods, and the mist began to lift. Holmes tapped ash from his cigarette and murmured, "The dead, Watson, are rarely silent. They speak through us, whether we invite them or not." Holmes unfolded a telegram he had retrieved from his coat pocket and read it with a slight twitch of the brow. "Bees again?" I ventured. "Worse," he said. "A beekeeper's widow in Eastbourne claims her husband has returned, though he was buried 2 months past." I raised an eyebrow. "Surely not another ghost?" Holmes tucked the paper away and smiled faintly. "No, my dear Watson. Merely a man with poor timing, or excellent tunnels." The train whistled once more as it veered east. We leaned back into our seats, the mist behind us, and the next mystery, quietly, inevitably, rising before us. As our train pulled steadily through the fog-laced countryside, I watched Holmes strike a match and light his pipe with the practiced ease of a man who had just put a ghost to rest. "Curious, Watson," he murmured, exhaling slowly. "How often men believe they can bury the past with bricks and wine racks, but the truth, like gold, tarnishes only when hidden too long." "You think it was guilt, then?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied. "Pride. Guilt listens. Pride silences." He tapped ash into a tray and leaned back. "Barrow unearthed more than bones. He disturbed a story someone spent a lifetime pretending never happened. What do you think was Etienne's gravest mistake? Trusting in shadows to protect him, or underestimating the mind that would follow them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed unravelling this mystery with us, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures, and share the case with those who never trust a locked cellar door.